forward, rather than to go into a huge amount of detail about acting and all of the different sort of steps and permutations of how actors developed over the centuries, I think we can safe to say that prior to the beginning of the 20th century, okay, the beginning of the 19 teens, acting had evolved slightly from what we saw in Shakespeare's time, but because of the fact that the theaters were so big and that the lighting was generally so poor, that acting was still caught in what we would call the declamatory acting. Declamatory being sort of declaration. Okay? People with big voices, big gestures. It actually got to a point where there was almost a code of gestures. So if you're in a theater, how many people have been to a big concert where they could barely see the stage? Now I know there's video assists for almost every concert. Okay? So how much could you actually see of the performer if you weren't looking at the video screen that's probably up behind them?
Like nothing.
There'd just be a tiny little figure, right? But, what you were saying?
Oh, nothing. I was just saying I went to Britney Spears.
You saw Britney Spears in that capacity? But was she projected up on a big screen?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's totally a new thing, and actually in some ways it's kind of weird, like you come to a live concert and now you're watching a movie. But on another level, you're hearing it in a way that you wouldn't obviously hear it in your home. But imagine seeing a play that way. Imagine seeing Hamlet or seeing one of the dramas that you've seen on TV, only where the actors are like tiny little figures. Add to that, in the 18th century, that the lights are on everywhere. There really is no much of an effective way of turning the lights out on the audience. It wasn't until the actor and manager David Garrick came along that he had the innovation of actually snuffing the candles that were over the audience and banishing people. They used to sell seats on the stage. So people would be sitting on the stage watching the acting, which would be equally distracting to people watching the show, right? The theater was really indoor theater for royalty, for the nobles. It was really as much about being seen, about the audience, as it was about the acting. David Garrick started to take it the other direction and focus people's attention more on the acting. And then when gas jet lighting came along, that allowed us to focus lighting even more on stage. Electric lighting took it a next step forward. But still, the theaters are gigantic. If you want to see what that style of acting might have looked like, how many people have seen a silent movie or a piece of a silent movie before? Okay, a Charlie Chaplin film or something like that. Okay? That is probably the closest you'll see to this declamatory style of acting. Where literally people are like, when they're sad or swooning, they're like this. They're angry, they're like this. Because they're bringing a style of acting to film that they learned on these giant stages. Film was a new medium, but there wasn't a way to act it yet. And again, they're trying to tell the whole story without sound. So when they're fighting someone, they have to show it with their whole body. They don't have the nuance of being able to speak. There's no audio. So what happened in the United States and in Russia in the beginning of the 20th century was a sort of perfect synergy of acting training and the medium changing at just the right time, as such, to create sort of an entirely new way of acting. Okay? And the person that really began it was somebody named Konstantin Stanislavski. And this was in Russia. And this was at the turn of the century. And he and another man named Dovchenko formed a theater called the Moscow Art Theater, which is arguably one of the world's most famous theaters. And what they did was, they were taking a material written by someone named Anton Chekhov, who had written some very realistic drama. And there were other realistic dramas that were out there. Ibsen had written some, Strindberg had written some, but the acting, again, these dramas were being performed in these gigantic theaters. So whereas the text was fairly realistic, They still had the problem of having to perform these in front of so many different people with terrible lighting, etc. But all of a sudden, Stanislavski, again, still performing them, but lots of times performing them in private theaters, smaller theaters, and becoming extremely detailed about the creation. He introduces an entirely different way of thinking about acting. Instead of trying to think about how the audience is perceiving you as an actor, he wanted you to stop concentrating on the audience and simply concentrate on the imaginative experience. What you were talking about the little kid pretending. Back to your roots as your core sort of born instinct as an actor. In other words, be in the experience and let the audience take away from it whatever they take away. And that creating that fourth wall in which the people on the stage are imagining that what's happening is real. Of course, they have to have some training. They have to have the sensibility so people can still see them and hear them. But a large part of their focus and their attention is simply on what is happening between each other. Okay? Being the character. Researching the character. The kind of research that somebody like Tom Cruise did for a movie like The Last Samurai. That kind of research, the kind of research that Robert De Niro does or Meryl Streep does for roles. Or really any character. How many people have seen the movie Ray? Okay, only a few people? Some? Okay? Right? And these movies, which are incredibly in-depth character studies, and we hear stories of actors, film actors, spending months researching these roles. This is something that is a product, a byproduct of the kind of training that Stanislavski did. Rather than rehearsing something quickly in just 2 weeks, plugging people in, giant tours all over the country, he's taking a group of actors and spending weeks, sometimes months, training them to play these roles. Extremely realistic sets, extremely realistic costumes for lower depths, Gorky's Lower Depths at the Moscow Air Theater. Stanislavski actually went down into the ghettos of Moscow and bought the rags and the clothes off of the homeless that were living in Moscow, and they wore those clothes. Okay? They took whole for Antoine in Paris, he took an entire a butcher shop. They bought the butcher shop, literally, in Paris, and brought all of the meat and everything into the theater. It was extreme naturalism, to give people a real sense of these people, sort of almost in a scientific way. Okay? And naturalism actually became sort of like a human laboratory. And when some of Stanislavski's students came to the United States, Maria Ouspenská, Richard Boleslavsky, came in the 1920s. They formed something called the American Laboratory Theater. And the American Laboratory Theater had a few students who would later train the actors and the theater teachers who have trained just about everyone you have ever seen on the professional stage or in movies. Pretty much every single person that you see today in a film or in a television show who is a successful actor, unless they came to acting through some other means like rock stardom or rap stardom or athletics or something else, if they have any training at all, they probably were trained by someone who was trained by someone who came from this discipline. Okay? Myself included, my acting teacher was trained by someone at the group theater who was trained by Stella Adler, who was trained by Stanislavski. And that is just the way it is in the United States. So these acting teachers came, some of the people that were there later formed a group called the Group Theater, which became probably the most influential theater company in the United States in the 20th century. Because Not just because the actors that came out of that and went on to Hollywood, etc., but because those acting teachers, Stella Adler, Sanford Meisner, Lee Strasberg, trained people like Robert De Niro, Marilyn Monroe, Kim Hunter, Meryl Streep, the list goes on and on, Robert Duvall, Al Pacino, all of the people that you would normally consider the sort of icons of American cinema. Okay? And after the American Laboratory Theater and the creation of the group theater, this theater came together, the group theater, in the beginning of the 1930s. By that time, Stanislavski himself left Russia, came to Paris, and was training people, and had put together, assembled what he called his system, okay, which was sort of a way of approaching acting, again, from a very internal style. Rather than concentrating on the effects of what you did on stage, concentrating on what you were doing. What we call the given circumstances. Imagining yourself in the circumstances, first and foremost. Trying to let your real emotions come out as if you were in that set of circumstances. And letting things just happen, what we call organically. Now, the group theater, yes, they were a revolutionary theater. They did perform on Broadway. There was no sponsorship or federal funding, so they had to sort of live and die like any other commercial theater. But their style of acting was extremely psychologically acute, very naturalistic. It was striking to people. But the people that it was most striking to were the people in Hollywood. Because at this particular time, something happened in the American cinema, which was the perfect intersection of a new way of acting and technology. And that something was sound. So when sound came into motion pictures, this sort of declamatory style of acting immediately became obsolete. So now all of a sudden, there was a real demand for people who could act in a very naturalistic way. In a way that really wasn't present on the American stage at that time. And remember, Hollywood at that time is taking a lot of actors from the stage and taking them out to Hollywood to fill these roles. That's where a lot of the main players came from. Sure, there were people that just sort of showed up in Hollywood who didn't know, which way was up. But when it came to creating big movies, Hollywood would go to New York and producers would grab people who were famous, already famous actors. But a lot of these people were doing this sort of stuff that really, now with the addition of sound, seemed like overacting.